Check, check, un, deux. Test un, deux. La lumière rouge est allumée. Okay. Le micro est maintenant actif.
It's a bit weird, right? I could go to the front. You watch this? Okay. Quand vous êtes prêts?
It's with a great pleasure that all the research forum welcomes today Callie Mady from UBC, and Dr. Mady's PhD is from Boise, and her expertise in teaching and learning French as a second language, and French is official second language. Yeah.
Oh, you got it.
Official language. And she will be arguing today that monolingualism can be cured. So, Callie, you have roughly 50 minutes,
okay.
And then we'll have the question period. And I will be very polite and will have to leave in 2:15.
Thank you. Ça va? Alors, j'ai préparé ma présentation en anglais, mais je vous encourage à poser des questions en français. I chose that title to be provocative, so I need to explain that a little bit. I don't think I'll have the answer for you today. Actually, the title comes from, I don't know originally, but Soleil Publishing has a button and a poster with that title. And so that's where I first saw it years, probably decades ago. And it's always stuck in my mind. So that's why I chose it. And partially because, as you'll see as we go through the presentation, I think there are steps we can take and have taken to move us along so that Anglophones in particular will be more of a motivated, let's say, to study French as a second language. I prepared my presentation for you students, especially, which means I'm not going into great detail about a project. I'm kind of taking you through a selective voyage of what I've done since I'm attached here. What I've done probably since the time I was at OISE, so I've selected some projects to share with you. You're very aware of our context, so I will just take out some snippets for you as they relate to where we're going. Interesting that the federal government says that official language bilingualism is part of our identity as Canadians. At the same time, they say that immigration is a challenge to official language duality. They don't elaborate on specific in terms of what that means, but they do identify it through the Commissioner of Official Languages that it is a challenge posed. At the same time, of course, evident more here in Ottawa than where I am in North Bay, that I'll tell you a bit more about in a minute, our population growth is due in great part to immigration. So that is really where I like to do my research, on immigrants learning French as a second language in English dominant contexts. I should explain, when I say English dominant, I'm referring to locations such as Toronto, for example, where the majority of students would attend school in English. And on such occasions, they would be learning French as a subject. So our federal government, many years ago, maybe when I was a teenager, and I think a lot of our public thinks, when you're an officially bilingual country, it means that you're committed to having people learn both languages. So over the last years, I've come to understand that that is not the case. And so we have access to certain services, but that does not necessarily translate to education in a second language. So an Anglophone learning French as a second language, for example, does not necessarily have a right to do so. So this is where our power lies, is within our provinces in terms of French second language education. Interesting, across our country, in general, no matter the population we're talking about, whether it be Anglophone or immigrant, as examples, there's a variety of accessibility to learn French as a second language. So it is obligatory in certain provinces and not in others. So depending on where you're located in the country, will perhaps pose challenges to your access to study French. Certain provinces recognize that we may have immigrants studying French as a second official language. So Alberta, for example, in their document, although it is only very short notation, notes that yes, indeed, in our classrooms there will be students for whom French is not their second language, but an additional language, they say. So it might be their second, their third, their fourth language. Ontario, according to the Ministry of Education, states that immigrants should be included in French second official language. But in a little while, we'll see that that doesn't always come to fruition in practice. British Columbia, where the study of a second language is obligatory, not necessarily French, mostly French, but not necessarily. So in some areas, Surrey, for example, may offer Punjabi, and so students could make that choice. However, British Columbia has a policy where immigrants can be exempt from that compulsory study of a second language. So just as you can see, from province to province, we have a variety of accessibility to French as a second language. We also have a variety of responses to what do we do with our ever-increasing population of immigrants that are arriving and may be interested in learning a second language. Similarly, we have an inconsistent response as to whether our students with learning difficulties should be included in French as a second language. Now, because I have a son with a learning difficulty, that has become another pathway for my research, but it is not my primary focus. Partially because of my background that I'll take you to, and partially because there was already lots of people looking at it when I was starting. So in our educational context, we know that there are exemptions, and those exemptions could be for students with learning difficulties. Exemptions could be not even just learning difficulties, but behavioral students, for example, are sometimes withdrawn from French as a second language, even though that disability may not have anything to do with language and difficulties in language. So some of our challenges as practicing teachers, if we're itinerant, so lots of core French teachers may be itinerant and they're moving from classroom to classroom to classroom, poses a challenge. It also gives a message to students, as I said in the first nugget there, that learning a second language is unnecessary. It also gives that same message to colleagues. I have my own classroom, I'm the core teacher, and the core French teacher will come and relieve me so I can do my prep. So it gives the message to my colleagues that French is a subject lesser than, gives the impression also to students who may remain in their room, they receive the same message. That message goes out to parents then, less so in immersion. Most of my research is in core French. We also found that there's a lack of collaboration. So when you have itinerant teachers and they may be entering 8 classrooms a day, and so they pass the teacher who's leaving in the hall, it gives them lots of contact points, which makes collaboration more difficult also. Another thing that might make collaboration more difficult is if they're not included as part of a core group of teachers. So for example, if they're not included in the literacy group, or if they're not included in the primary junior group of teachers. So when we look at core French then, we have students that have negative attitudes. We have a high dropout rate. So in Ontario, they have to take French till the end of grade 9, at which point we lose 75% of our students in core French. And they have a low achievement. So that does not pertain to immersion. So immersion I'll come to at various points throughout, and it is the focus of a pilot project I've done that I'll tell you about in the end. But my love is core French. My love is core French because I go back to my title and I believe that we can fix it. And we have lots of research for decades in immersion also. So I've taught core French, immersion, extended French for the International Baccalaureate program. Started in Halton, which is in Burlington. And then in Peel, the majority of my career was in Peel. So in Peel, that's Mississauga and Brampton. So you're starting to see a connection with immigrants. So in the schools that I taught at, I would have been in a minority. So then went and got my ESL qualifications and started to teach ESL also. And so as I build throughout my career, I noticed that these students aren't being included in my French classroom. What's going on? So started to advocate to have them included. Same with our students with learning difficulties. Started to advocate to have them included in my class. Why? Because I saw that they could be successful, and they cannot always be as successful in other subject areas that requires them to have a certain level of English, for some of them. Funny, even when I was in teachers college way back when, I asked for my placement to be in vocational schools. And some of you might know there isn't always French as a second language offered in vocational schools. So that gives you the perception there too, that there are certain people who cannot learn a second language. So I chose to go to vocational schools. They had to search far and wide, but way back then, working with that belief, although at that point it was not articulated, that I thought that at least at that level, they could all be successful to learn a second language. And part of my practice too, I organized exchanges for my students at secondary level in core French with CEVEC. So I give you that background so you know some of my bias, so you can judge what I say accordingly. And also because you'll see that it took me certain places in my research. Don't worry, that's nobody texting me or anything. So, especially for students, if you're doing grad work now or you're going to do grad work, I taught 16 years and then I was at OISE for 3 years, so U of T. And then in that time, I think the first 2 years I was finishing my doctorate there as well. So working there, finishing my doctorate. And as I'm finishing my doctorate, I'm not there in a tenure track position. So I don't have access to certain types of grants that I could get money to do my research. And here we go, SEVEC, which if you don't know is an organization, you can help me, Society of Educational Visits and Exchanges in Canada. Okay. So I did exchanges with them when I was a teacher, and then had the opportunity to do research for them when I was in that period. So sometimes you do research that you choose. This is my case. And in other times you have opportunities that present themselves, and such was that with SEVEC. Stephanie too was on, you have to help me, at least for the first project that's on the screen, as probably many projects as you'll see as we go through. So my experience offering exchanges to my students goes with my belief that that is something that can make a difference in motivation. Obviously, also linguistically, but I was most interested in core French in making an impact non-linguistically, so in motivating my core students. So that works with monolingualism can be cured. So SEVEC asked me to do an evaluation of a volunteer youth program. So in that program, students would volunteer a week in a Francophone community and another week in an Anglophone community. Another project was the short-term effects of exchanges where the students would go for a week and stay with a family, so more traditional than the first, and then their partner would return to their community, and one French and one English across the country, most of the French happening in Quebec. And then we looked at the long-term impact of those most common exchanges. And as we go along, I'm going to give you snippets of the results of those three. I'm going to get that out of your way. How's that? But I think they share foci, those projects, in that we wanted to know how authentic bilingual experiences could impact attitudes, but also language proficiency. So looking at the volunteer project and how we collected our data, we used questionnaires, interviews, and observations. And the other two projects, short-term questionnaires and journals. So the students participating in the exchange wrote responses to questions in their journals. And the long-term were questionnaires and interviews that were conducted over the phone. Interesting, students are on a volunteer mission, and there was an increase in confidence in writing, although they did not have an occasion in their volunteer experience to write. So it was not a result that we had anticipated. And we also found that it depended on the task that they were given as volunteers, how successful that was. To give an example, if they were asked to collect garbage at a festival, for example, then that did not give them a lot of opportunity to interact with Francophones. However, if they were able to give directions, and that was one of their jobs as a volunteer, then it would be considered more authentic, and students valued that more. In the short term, our students self-assessed their language prior to the exchange and post-exchange, so they're only 1 week in in the environment. So Anglophones in Quebec, Francophones elsewhere across the country. Anglophones said they noted an increase in speaking skills, and Francophones noticed an increase in all skills, including their strategy use. And I'll get to long-term in a minute. Just some excerpts from their journals, so the short-term journals. Note a tone of surprise. Wow, I can improve my language just by using it. There was the average age was 14. So again, focus on speaking, looking forward to using their speaking skills, although I didn't show you, they did so with some apprehension. And then again, one of our Francophone participants. Again, anticipating before the exchange that they would have positive results. So although there was some trepidation, they went into the exchange thinking that it would be worthwhile. These are students who had participated in one of those traditional exchanges 6 to 9 years after we contacted them. Again, just a reminder, by questionnaire and phone interviews. And they indicated that yes, indeed, that because of their skills, that they related to the exchange, that they were given more job opportunities than they would have elsewhere, and that they continued to use their second language, some of them in the job opportunity that they had been given. Not surprisingly, given our context, that the Anglophones said they had fewer such opportunities than Francophones. In our volunteer research with CIVEC, there was an increase in motivation, and not just motivation in a second language, but to be involved in a community that came from the volunteering. And again, in our short term, interesting, students were motivated before they left. Students were willing to communicate before they left, as you got some clues in the journal. And but despite their high ranking before they left, they did indicate that there was growth. So they were more willing to communicate after the exchange. For me, one of the messages from that was the majority were immersion students. It is a majority of immersion students who are provided opportunities to go on exchange. I don't know the reasons. I could guess, but I don't have data to support my guess. But you'll see in a minute that I think, therefore, we can look to provide such opportunities for our other students also. So 6 to 9 years after such a short-term experience, our students told us that they sought out opportunities to use their French, to get jobs with French or English. In the job market, that was of primary importance. So a link between, economic capital that comes with being official language bilingual. It also afforded them opportunities to travel to English and French regions outside of Canada. And they continued to seek other opportunities. So French cinema, music, for example. So Graham Fraser says every child should have an opportunity to go on an exchange. The fact of the matter is 1% of our students have that opportunity. So I would support that it would be nice to increase the number of students who go on exchange. And our results highlight that it has positive opportunities, particularly for our Anglophones who don't necessarily have those opportunities, or they don't access them. So they're less apt to turn on a French show than a Francophone would turn on an English show. And I would propose that, or I would advocate for including students who are in core, in addition to those who are immersion. So rather than thinking that we have to attain a certain language level to gain the benefits of an exchange, that perhaps those benefits would be motivation, and there would be a result. So this circular process you have, similar to something, if you've read Alina McFarlane's thesis, so saying that you start with formal language learning, you can go on an exchange experience, the result of which is improved linguistic abilities, improved confidence, and then you go back to your classroom, and the goal would be that there would be a spiral that they would continue with their formal language learning because of their advancement in motivation and proficiency. So 3 shorter projects funded by SAVEC in a time in my career where obviously I was invested in exchanges, believed in exchanges, and did this research happily. But when I couldn't have my own choice of what I wanted to do with funding attached. So again, on our theme, always looking for ways to improve French as a second language education, looking at issues of access for, that stands for English language learners. Not always immigrants, but in my case, looking at immigrants and looking at improving access for students with learning difficulties, always grounded in my belief that both of those groups can be successful, either in immersion or in core French. So when I look at what I really love in terms of multilingualism, I like to look at whether English language learners are immigrants for the most part, are included, and if we can get better access to French as a second language for our immigrant population. So when we look at our teaching population and the supporting research that we have on the screen, Kalman, for example, because teachers requested it when she was doing her research in the former York region, tested a subgroup in listening of English language learners because teachers were concerned that they didn't know how to respond to their needs or that they weren't being as successful in French. And she found that they indeed were as successful, and they were as successful as their peers, even though they didn't have the same amount of time in French. Research done in Ottawa, the second one, found that there were a variety of practices happening in the same board. So at one school, yes, our immigrant and our English language learners, they would be included in French, always. In another school, they would never be included. In another school, well, we'll see. Same finding with me. That was done at secondary school, and I also talked to guidance counselors and principals to try and find out why is this happening. Interesting, the principals and the guidance counselors said that they were aware that the students could be successful, but they didn't include them necessarily. Sometimes because of age, they said, because they need to focus on their English, were some of the reasons given. And then the last research cited there is a teacher voice, again, similar to Kalman, saying, we're concerned that we don't know how to respond to this increasing diversity in our classroom, whether it be students with learning difficulties or our English language learners. So that's an education perspective. And then when we go to the immigrant population themselves, all the research on the screen tells us, so Dagenet interviews with parents in British Columbia, 12 different families, South Asian families, saying that yes, they want to be included in immersion. So her research was done in immersion, and they want to be included for various reasons. They want their children to have the advantages that come with being official language bilingual. And so they made the choice to enroll their children in French immersion. And that would give them advantages here, but it would also give them advantages elsewhere. And those families continued to maintain their home language at home, or some of them also on a Saturday day, morning school. My students, that was at secondary level, that was at core French, again, they were more motivated than their peers to learn French also. And in general population with Parkin and Turcotte, the general Canadian population says, they use the word allophones. Allophones are more motivated to learn French and to have their children learn French than the Anglophone population. So a bit of a dilemma in terms of what the parents of our English language learners say and feel, and what the people in education have to say. So still probably, I think I was in my first year at Nipissing when I had this opportunity provided by Canadian Parents for French. So time in my career where I get that it so happens that what Canadian Parents for French is interested in, what I was interested in was similar. And so looked at the views of immigrant parents here and in British Columbia, and at university students who were immigrants themselves, and wanted to know about their experience getting access to French as a second language. So again, how the data was collected, interviews and questionnaire for the university students. So interestingly enough, the parents tell us we arrive in Canada and we are provided with information about schooling, but they are provided information about schooling from a variety of sources that aren't necessarily in education. So maybe from a neighbor, maybe from a friend, maybe from a relative who came before them. And so they don't have all the information to make the decisions they would like. So you'll see there that they weren't even aware that there was a French immersion program. In Ontario, they weren't even aware that they had a choice between, that there was an option for a Catholic choice. So decisions that maybe people, stakeholders in education took for granted, they said they didn't know. And once they learned and tried to register their children in immersion, so at that point it would have been late immersion, it might have been extended French, there were challenges, as you can see from some of our comments there. So wanted to get in the French immersion program, but told your English needs to be better to do so. Then a teacher within the program communicating to an English language learner that they weren't in the right place being in immersion because, again, their English wasn't strong enough. So again, a repetitive theme in that we have adult immigrants who want to make certain choices for their children and who have challenges doing so. They want to make those decisions because they knew before coming here that we were a bilingual country. They had certain ideas about what that meant. So they imagined what Canada would be before they arrived. And they imagined, as I did maybe when I was a teenager, that, you know, when you're an official bilingual country, that everybody would speak or at least learn both official languages. But they believed, similar to Dagenet's research, that their children would benefit. Interesting enough, the adults also sought opportunities to learn French as a second language. And this research was happening in Southern Ontario and British Columbia. Again, another repetitive theme that may not come to fruition is attaching gaining French as a second official language to better jobs. So now that I'm at Nipissing and I was able to apply and successfully got a grant, so that's nice that you can create your own research project. I did something similar to it that I did back in my doctorate. So looked at 3 groups of students. My goal is the same, and I'm not a quantitative person. I don't love numbers. But if my goal is to try and inform stakeholders in education, principals who are the gatekeepers sometimes, teachers, I think those numbers are important for them. And so choose to use quantitative data, although I find it challenging. So in this study, I had the same 3 groups of students, but this time was at the grade 6 level. It was in core French. So I have a group of unilingual English-speaking students, Canadian-born multilingual students. So they had, their parents, for example, were immigrants and they have a home language other than French or English, and then multilingual immigrants. So distinguishing, in my opinion, is important between someone who is an immigrant themselves as children and those who are children of immigrants. We used a partial DELF test, a questionnaire, and in the bigger study that I'm not going to share with you today, we did do interviews with students and teachers and observations of the classrooms, of which there were 8. So here's some numbers for you. So with the results, we put the reading sections together, the writing sections together, the speaking sections together as statistics permitted, and then we wanted to know, is there a difference between the groups? So the top table says yes, there's a difference, and the bottom tells you where those differences are. So if you look at where the asterisks, it tells you that are multilingual Canadian-born and are, I call them allophones, so those are our immigrant students. There's a difference between them and our unilingual students on writing, and on speaking between our immigrant students and our Canadian-born unilingual. It is always those 2 groups outperforming our Canadian-born English-speaking students. In the questionnaire, we had various items, again, made composite variables according to our principal component analysis. So meaning we put the items together where we could or deleted them where we could not. Again, same thing. This test tells us, is there a difference on the questionnaire among the groups? It tells us sometimes there is. So then we want to look more specifically with a post-hoc test, where are those differences? So again, you'll note the differences happen between our immigrant group and our Canadian-born English-speaking students. But only on those 3 variables, so that aren't very clear. So let me explain. French continue means how apt or how willing are they to continue studying French? Right now they're in grade 6. Their anxiety towards studying French and their willingness to communicate in French in the classroom. So then I want to see if these factors predict the results. So now putting together test with questionnaire and see if the questionnaire can predict. And so you'll note, I'll draw your attention particularly to anxiety, metalinguistic awareness. I draw your attention there because they are most interesting because they go contrary to some of the research. But I don't imagine you would be surprised that the more people use French outside of the classroom, the better they did on certain components of the test. So that's with French with friends, French in class also, and did they hear French outside of class? So the more they did, the better. However, it is the opposite as I would have predicted for anxiety. The more anxious they were, the better they did. Our immigrant group was also most anxious. We have to consider that it was a testing situation. We have to consider that that is in speaking. And in the speaking situation, they were in a room with a researcher that they did not know. But it is interesting also that it was connected to that group. So when you think about Cummins' research, and Cummins would say that their ability to do well in French will be correlated to their proficiency in their first language, perhaps also their proficiency in English. They self-assessed their proficiency in their language of origin, and that was not the case. So their ability to do well in French was not related to their proficiency in their language of origin. So this is where I'm working on it right now, so I can only give you a sneak peek. So time for me to take the same emphasis to an immersion classroom. Interesting, 12 classes trying to get the students as immigrants themselves in immersion is difficult. Not difficult to get enough multilinguals, so our children of immigrants. But it is interesting that that question of access continues. This time we used a full DELF test. We also tested their English this time. So again, I wanted to look at whether their proficiency in English was related to their proficiency in French. And we used a questionnaire also. So basically, a pilot study. So I can only give you, so far I have quantitatively, I have only looked at comparing the unilingual English-speaking students. I should say, I know they're not really unilingual. I want to validate that they do know some French, but that's how I linguistically distinguish my groups for you. So I only looked at them, the English-speaking students, and compared them to the multilinguals, so children of immigrants themselves. And in immersion, we find the same thing. So our multilinguals are outperforming our English-speaking Canadian-born students. Interesting. Again, we did interviews, but there weren't great differences, if any, that came out in the qualitative data as of yet. I need to mine it a bit more, but that's where I am right now. There were not a lot of differences in the qualitative data. And perhaps they're also grade 6 students, so I would say the majority weren't very verbose either. They didn't know us. Some of them were fun. So some things in terms of points of discussion that I'll leave you with. Proficiency levels is something that I have to put more thought into and more investigation into. Perhaps it is the level of French, although in immersion the level went higher, but in core French I would have said that, you know, perhaps it is task-based, it is linguistically based, that it is not as challenging, that would require proficiency to perform better. But if it comes out the same with immersion, I'm going to have to do more research there myself. Similarly with the higher anxiety and performing better for immigrants. So my next steps, still going to continue working with the grade 6 French immersion data. And again, I'm curious to see, and I don't think I mentioned it for you, although it was on the screen, in the core French with the grade 6 students, those who indicated using their multilinguistic awareness in the class had lower results. So I need to do more reading there. That was a surprising result. My guess, not supported yet, my guess would be it may have to do with the classroom they were in that we did observe, where the teacher who taught, I'm forgetting how many classes, let's say she taught 6 of the 8 classes, used French in a core French classroom to teach French. She shared a language with a lot of the students. Punjabi, she never used Punjabi. She did not use English either. So I wonder if the students then translated that their use of other languages would not support their French language learning. But again, I'm speculating on that one. Similarly with anxiety, something that I have to continue to look at and to do some more reading on myself. So I leave you with a question, as bold as my title, probably. We have sufficient data, in my opinion, from Canada, but also with supporting data from Europe, to say that these two communities that I'm most interested in, so that our immigrants are capable of learning English and French at the same time. I think we have enough data to say that our students with learning difficulties are in the same situation. They are able to succeed in English and learn French as a second language. However, we continue to question whether that is possible. And I think the judgment goes beyond whether a teacher can accommodate for such students, because sometimes they're not even getting in. So my question is, what's it going to take? How much information? Is it more information that we need? Or is it a dissemination of that information? Or perhaps, not perhaps, but it goes along with research from England, from research from Australia, that says that English-speaking people, at least in those two regions, have the idea that English is sufficient. And so they don't need to pursue second language learning. I'll just leave you with a little story. When I was a practicing teacher, I went to see Howard Gardner. We had a PD day. Everybody in the board was off, and we went to see Howard Gardner speak on his multiple intelligences. That's great. It's very exciting. And so I'm in a room, you can imagine. It was a very big board. Everybody was there, and gives a great speech. And at the end, there's time for questions. Several people ask questions. The last question posed was, why isn't there a second language learning intelligence? And he said, because if you speak English, you don't need to learn a second language. This is in front of all of my colleagues, without time to say anything, without time to have another question posed, having a guru in the front of the room. So I think that's one of our challenges too. It's not just to get this information to educators or to get this information to administrators, but also to get this information to the ministry, and also to get this information to our professional colleagues, to a variety of stakeholders, and in the government as well, to see if we can make some progress as the rest of the world does become more multilingual. So I think if we don't, we'll be at a disadvantage. So I'm going to leave that with you, and hoping that you have questions, but hoping that maybe you have some answers for me too. Yeah? Thank you. That was perfect.
And please press the touch button when you are asking questions. You have the microphone, so it will get recorded.
They're scared now. Me approve? If you're too shy to ask the question with the microphone, you could ask, I could repeat it. Then I'll take responsibility for the question.
Yeah, like the person who raised their hand, usually it's for voice, but I don't think we have voicing. He might need to type the question. Yes. Yes, he does.
So he can hear us
You will
now.
see the question on it.
Je veux juste, vous avez terminé en disant c'est multilinguisme existe dans les autres pays. Quand on se rend en Europe, ce qu'on voit, c'est, comme Gardner l'a dit, c'est l'importance et la place de l'anglais. Que ce soit dans les universités, et en fin de compte, ils enseignent avec l'anglais. Et c'est l'anglais qui prend le dessus dans toutes les universités européennes. Alors, je ne sais pas s'il y a vraiment, cet aspect de multilinguisme en Europe. Ça existe?
Ah, nous n'entendons pas les participants, il faut appuyer sur... Oh, il n'y a pas de bouton ici. Okay.
Voilà, mais tu peux reprendre la question si tu veux.
Ah, je suis tout à fait d'accord qu'il s'intéresse à apprendre et à utiliser l'anglais, mais je dirais que comparé au Canada, il y a beaucoup plus d'étudiants qui étudient une deuxième, troisième langue, même si la troisième est l'anglais ou même la deuxième en Europe qu'ici. Et ce que j'aimerais, que je n'ai pas dit, c'est que il y a aussi, et je pense que c'est une minorité en Europe, mais il y a des endroits où ils offrent des cours aussi dans la langue des immigrants. Ça veut dire qu'ils appuient la langue d'origine en même temps que la langue du pays et peut-être ils apprennent une autre langue en même temps. Alors, ça c'est important à dire. Je pense que c'est important que dans les écoles, pendant la journée, nous offrons de l'appui à ces élèves. Et dans ce système où j'ai collectionné des données, mais c'est fort possible parce qu'on a une majorité d'immigrants. Non? Alors, on pourrait offrir un cours en Punjabi, par exemple.
Moi, j'ai un commentaire qui vient de la recherche que je mène actuellement et qui concerne les immigrants adultes et leur insertion bilingue dans la société canadienne ou l'insertion peut-être du côté francophone. Et des entrevues que je mène, ce qui ressort, c'est que, comme tu as dit, tu sais, les ministères, il y a beaucoup de... c'est très important, je pense, que la société généralement croit au multilinguisme, puis les gens commencent à y croire. Donc, ce qui arrive dans le processus d'immigration, les ambassades canadiennes sont formées, le service étranger sont formés à présenter le Canada comme pays bilingue. Donc, les immigrants qui postulent pour l'immigration, ils reçoivent cette formation-là dans leur pays, qu'ils arrivent dans un pays bilingue. C'est la formation de la diplomatie du ministère des Affaires étrangères canadienne. Et ils arrivent ici et aux douanes, ils sont dirigés vers les services d'insertion, des services qui vont les aider dans les premières semaines au Canada. Et ce qui ressort de mes entrevues, c'est que les douaniers leur disent, mais écoutez, important c'est l'anglais, et on les dirige vers l'anglais. Bon, si leur langue maternelle n'est pas l'anglais, on les dirige vers l'anglais, même s'ils viennent du Burundi, et puis ils ont fait toute leur école en français, ils viennent du Burundi, donc on les envoie automatiquement vers l'anglais. Et c'est la vaste majorité des gens que j'ai interviewés, des immigrants adultes que j'ai interviewés, ils arrivent ici avec cette idée, on arrive dans un pays bilingue où je pourrais développer le français et l'anglais, vivre en français et en anglais, puis pouf, à la frontière, à l'entrée, c'est un autre discours. Et 6 mois plus tard ou 7 mois plus tard, ces gens-là, ils arrivent avec l'impression, et c'est horrible à dire, mais c'est pas complètement faux, c'est assez frappant, ça ressort de ces entrevues-là, qu'il y a un genre d'élitisme linguistique, que le bilinguisme, c'est pour les meilleurs. C'est-à-dire, on va dire, tu vas être bilingue, tu vas avoir une bonne job, tu vas avoir l'accès à ça, tu vas avoir l'accès à ça, mais à l'école, tu peux pas être bilingue, c'est juste l'anglais. Les services, on va t'offrir juste en anglais. Donc, ils ont comme cette impression que le bilinguisme, c'est pas... OK, oui, on est dans un pays bilingue, mais le bilinguisme, c'est pour une élite. Donc, apparemment, on les exclut. C'est un peu pour alimenter, tu sais, pour compléter ce que tu vois avec les parents, avec les enfants, ce que tu disais, que l'attitude change pas forcément positivement, je dirais. Parce que les gens se disent, OK, bon, ben, c'est pas pour moi, je suis pas assez bon, je peux pas me rendre là. C'est un peu l'attitude que je vois chez les parents, qui peut, à un moment donné, déteindre sur la motivation aussi à l'école, etc.
Et vous pouvez imaginer qu'ils arrivent au Canada, ils reçoivent même plus de points s'ils parlent les deux langues, ou même s'ils peuvent dire une phrase en français, ils peuvent cocher et recevoir certains points.
Le discours à l'extérieur est très, très clair. On est un pays bilingue, c'est valorisé, on va vous aider et on fonctionne dans les deux langues. Puis à la frontière, ils reçoivent un autre discours. Donc la formation des douaniers est déjà différente que la formation des services étrangers. Et là, ils arrivent au conseil scolaire où c'est encore pas cette formation qu'on va être tous bilingues, c'est pour tout le monde et vous êtes bienvenus, etc.
Alors, je pense que nous devons informer non juste les enseignants, les directeurs, mais aussi les personnes, les douaniers.
Peut-être tout le monde. Un peu. Y croire nous-mêmes.
Mais je pense que nous avons commencé avec les élèves avec les difficultés d'apprentissage, qu'ils veulent avoir accès à l'immersion. Alors, je pense qu'on a commencé là, mais peut-être on va continuer, mais maintenant avec les personnes qui doivent apprendre l'anglais en même temps. Peut-être on va y arriver naturellement. Toujours optimiste. Sylvie.
Thank you, Callie, for a wonderful presentation. Before I do my comment and my question, just the person who had raised their hand electronically, if you type in your question, we might be able to see it and read it, because unfortunately we don't have the ability to hear the audio. So whoever had raised their hand earlier that they have a question, just type it out, and at one point I'll shut up and we'll read out your question. My question touches a little bit on elements that Monica just raised, with things that you had raised earlier in your discussion about sort of the elite or elitist view we have around French language education, French as a second language education, not just for immersion, but when you think of core French, because something that my background's in French first language education in a minority context, and something that I had not really paid attention to before I came to the University of Ottawa was the fact that there is, at this time in Ontario, no real core French options or French immersion options for our college-bound or workplace-bound students. But when you look at, people like Monica Heller and Alexandre Duchesne, all their research on the importance of multilingualism in the workplace, in the service industry, our frontline workers, the people who need to have access to multilingualism or at least bilingualism. A lot of these kids don't even have access to. And we have a lot of comments coming out of immersion research saying, if there's nothing in university, why should students go all the way to grade 12 in immersion if there's nothing, there's some programs, there's Ottawa U, there's something at SFU, Glendon is trying to do more. What do our community colleges offer for students who are graduates, the few students who may have taken pre-college core French, but all of our students who perhaps were in French immersion up until grade 7, how many get streamed out if they're going into applied classes rather than theoretical classes by the time they're in grade 9? Who can learn languages? A little anecdote before I let you answer is I have a cousin who's the same age as me, 47. He's a high special needs young man who is at about a 5-year-old cognitive developmental skill, and he was in school till the age of 25 in special programs, none of them in French, but his parents are Francophone. And so he went to school, he learned to read in English, and he stayed with us for a week about 15 years ago. And he speaks with us in French, but when it's time to read words, because he can read some words like stop and go and play, one way he looked at my dad and he goes, Adrien, I talk to you in French, but when I read to you in English, because I don't get it. Not in that beautiful sentence, but it just dawned on him that day that everything was going on in French, but it was like, Jean wants to watch a movie. Okay, Jean wants to watch a movie. Play. And then he he realized that his discourse of "Je veux regarder le film" and play was not the same language. But his parents have now continued, he can now read in English and in French, even with a 5-year-old developmental level. So it asks questions, are we underestimating and making decisions that are limiting those? And if we're doing that for our Canadian students, it might explain some of the attitudes, because if the majority of the people did not have access, they might not see the benefits, which might explain some of the choices that we're making. You know, the road to I don't know where is paved with good intentions, right?
Yeah.
So I'm just throwing that back at you. I don't know what kind of question that is, but.
So from the mouth of your nephew, was
My
it your
cousin.
nephew, your cousin? We can learn a lot, huh? But I'm anxious to see the new curriculum that's going to come out, I assume in December, so I'm told. I'm anxious because I reviewed both the core and the immersion secondary draft documents. And the immersion document had applied level courses. And I really hope to see that when the final document comes out. But funny enough, I didn't get to review it a second time. So that's interesting. And maybe just to get other people's input. But I want to see whether it's going to come to fruition. The core French also, when I reviewed it, had a stream for beginners. So that would be for immigrants who arrive. You know, they could arrive when they're 15, and they would have an option also. And that would respond to some of the teachers' concerns about having them in a classroom with people who have studied for 5 years. So I'm hoping that there's going to be some headway there, because a lot of our teachers are from immersion too. So they're entering the profession with that experience that may not include peers with learning difficulties. So they may not know that indeed there are people with language-based learning difficulties that can perform as well in immersion as their peers in a mainstream English classroom. I'm hopeful. We'll see. Please.
Yeah, so it was interesting to me that you mentioned that some of your findings were that immigrants were occasionally excluded from the French curriculum because they needed to speak better English. And so that's on the part of institutions or educators or teachers or counselors. And but I also anecdotally get the sense that sometimes immigrants themselves self-exclude, because I'm thinking specifically in the immersion context. If you are well informed and you know that you have the option of sending your child to immersion or to an English school, and your home language is something other than French or English, you're kind of juggling with a very difficult decision. You're thinking, well, is the home language going to suffer? Or is my child, if I send my child to immersion, maybe they will, and I speak this home language, which is different from English, then my child maybe will learn some French, but their English will not get enough. So I sometimes get the sense that immigrants self-select English education for that concern. And perhaps here there is a level at which we could probably get more information in terms of the importance of the minority language and how the majority language anyway gets acquired. But is there any data or any of your findings that show this kind of trend of immigrants to self-exclude themselves and actually deprive themselves of the potential benefits of official bilingualism?
No, but probably because of the participants I chose. So it may be out there, but because of the participants I selected, I didn't get that information, nor did I seek that information. But I would like to make a couple of comments. One being with immersion, the more points of entry that a board can offer, the greater opportunity for immigrants to be able to enter at a certain point. So if a board has the ability, and not all of them do, to offer an early immersion, middle immersion, a late immersion, if immigrants arrive and that is their concern, then they can have English well established and hopefully have an opportunity to enter immersion if they choose to do so. But I would like to give the choice to that community. Give the choice to the parents. Yes, inform them. No matter what their choices are for education for their children, I would like them to be well informed. I would like everybody to be well informed of their choices, and I certainly don't want to suggest that they should all go in a certain direction. But similarly with supporting their language of origin, that we can share information that yes, continue to support the language of origin, continue to speak that language at home, because many of them may feel pressured to speak English at home in order to support their children. British Columbia has been, I think, in partnership with Canadian Parents for French. And Canadian Parents for French, if you look on their website, they have information about French immersion in a variety of languages that, that I think is great. And they also have information for children in a variety of languages. So British Columbia has been making use of those publications. And I actually think it started there through a lady named Rita, I don't know her last name, who was with Canadian Parents for French there. So that's how they're trying to inform their immigrant populations about choices. Wendy Carr's research, too, is interesting. That was done in intensive French. Intensive French meaning Newfoundland version intensive French, starting in grade 5 for half of a year, found that those students, the immigrant students there, of course, they're French, they had a higher level of proficiency in French than their counterparts who were registered in core French classroom, but they also had higher levels of English. Yeah, so lots of information out there that we can share.
I was very interested by your results regarding the positive relationship between anxiety and either French speaking. And it goes contrary to my own findings repeatedly. I mean, but that's interesting. And one way of interpreting it, and we saw that in a few studies, is when you assess anxiety, you could be also assessing what is known as arousal. And so the person is at a degree of anxiety which is still helpful and not debilitating. So part of it's an inverted U curve. So if you're past the midpoint, then you cannot speak. You stop speaking French. In fact, you cannot speak at all. But for the first part of the curve, the more anxious you are, the better you would be, not only at speaking, but at doing just about anything you do, because you're just more aware, okay, more aroused, more interested, more into the. So it may be a detail of. It would be interesting to see if you had very, very anxious people, overly anxious people, then you would get the negative part of the curve. So that's just an idea.
You're the expert. I can't. But I do find it interesting that it was our immigrant population. And I was reading a cultural ecological theory from Ogbu and Simons that explains when you have voluntary immigrants compared to involuntary immigrants or refugees, that they may have higher levels of anxiety that would prove to be positive motivators.
Yeah.
So, certainly something that I need to investigate further.
In another study, it was a study of Canadian Indian immigrants to Canada. And what we found, we were looking at what is the effect of discrimination and how does knowledge of language, in this case English, would work to moderate the effect of discrimination on their degree of stress. So the dependent variable is stress here. And we found, of course, that if you are more confident in English, discrimination won't affect you. as much as if you are highly confident. So high confidence in English kind of disrupts the effect of discrimination, except that in all cases, people who were highly confident in English were also very stressed, generally, even though there was no difference between the two groups, high and low discrimination. And we were wondering why that was. And one reason, and we've not followed this up at all, one reason could have been because if you are very confident in English, that means you have a lot of interaction, generally a lot of interaction with other people, and that might bring up your stress level because you are out there, like, you know,
Right.
you're struggling in the other language, and also the possibility that you may be victim of discrimination, even though you're coping with it. So that's another more social interpretation of the.
Thank you. And you reminded me also that, and I don't think I shared it with you, this was a similar community. So no Italian speakers, Spanish speakers, but yeah, the majority of students from India, Pakistan.
I was just going to say, because the piece of work from that project that I'm trying is the anxiety piece that I was trying to look at. And I think your point is well founded, because if you look at the willingness to communicate data, and that the immigrant population was very willing to communicate. I think the items that we used in the questionnaire, I was part of developing the questionnaire, were taken from a lot of previous literature related to anxiety, were questions like, I feel nervous when, or so they're inherently a little bit negative. Whereas the interview questions that we asked them were, what are your favorite parts, least favorite parts? And so there may be a little bit more variation to triangulate with those to get at exactly what you're talking about, the notion of anxiety being more than just negative stress, or, yeah, and which would probably be useful in explaining them.
So at times we've had more success with the confidence scale, language
Yes.
confidence scale. Okay, reversing the items. And that gave us better results than the anxieties.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I'm gonna cough. So just to bring the discussion back to your previous points with your research and examples, I'm particularly concerned, sort of negative connotation, but interested in the exchange procedure for cultural exchange. And I was wondering if you encountered any research or any literature on certain barriers or blockages for people coming to try and learn French in core French or French immersion if they come from a different country on a cultural exchange. So not necessarily permanent immigration, but just a one-year trip or a summer trip or anything of the sort.
Okay, can you tell me more? I'm not sure I understood the question.
Have you come across anything that supports, in the same way as immigrants, with barriers that come in terms of learning the language for people who come for cultural exchanges or who go on exchanges for volunteering or for anything of the sort?
I haven't. I didn't collect data, but as a teacher, teaching with a majority of immigrants or children of immigrants in, I think at that point I was in Mississauga, it was a challenge for me to get enough students to go on exchange. And it was a challenge because they were concerned about religious restrictions. They were concerned about dietary restrictions. And I have to admit, I put no thought into that when I started out. Similarly, I have done an electronic exchange and found, and this was as a teacher, so I did not collect any data, but found that there were challenges in topics of discussion, even when they weren't aware of the cultural background of the participants. So I can see that there would be challenges that some families might not want their children to partake in an exchange. It's a risk. It's a risk for anybody, I think.
And also for your questionnaires at the beginning, so the forms you had the children fill out for a bit their anxiety level or how they felt going into the exchange and motivation factors, was there any follow-up the first or second day when they got there? So from the idealized version of course I'll speak the language, of course I'll integrate myself and make a bunch of friends, versus their first day where they're, oh, everyone's actually speaking French. This is tough.
Absolutely. And jump in if your memory's better than mine, which it is. But I remember that most being communicated through the journals rather than through the quantitative data. However, they did remain positive and willing for the most part. But it was always accompanied by anxiety, by worry, by not being able to communicate. And that was even before they went. So they went on exchange knowing it would be a challenge, and they decided to accept that challenge, hoping that they would reap rewards. So they already went in knowing that there were challenges. And of course, their opportunity to use the language is highly dependent on the family that they're with or their partner, also dependent on language proficiency, which language they take up, for example. You want to add?
No, all I would add, I think, is that I can only speak to the volunteer youth exchange portion, because I don't think the other studies was it taken from that data, or was it? Okay. The journals are fascinating. So CEVEC actually has them, they are obligated, correct? To write in, obligated. Well, highly encouraged, yeah, but I mean, I think they take on a certain responsibility because it's a funded exchange. I think that's the other thing that a lot of is not really communicated when exchanges are promoted, that CEVEC pays for these students to go, aside from some expenses that they have to fund. Transportation. So there's an investment in that side of things from the student. They have to do their own application and so on. So for this particular exchange, over the course of the entire exchange, every night they had a couple of questions they had to answer. So I remember looking at that data, and the questions are very interesting. Describe a moment today when you used your second language, because in the volunteer youth exchange, I guess two aspects. The first festival they went to was in an English community. And unfortunately, our sample wasn't evenly split between Francophone and Anglophone students, if I remember correctly. So everybody was in the community where they spoke the language, which resulted in the sort of counselors or the leaders speaking a lot of French. So they were really hooked into using French, even though it was in an English community. And there was a lot of instances of the role of those particular leaders in really keeping them going and testing them and so on. But in terms of your question related to the journals, it was definitely a road which gave, I think, for the project, a lot of juicy data in that respect. It's kind of ongoing, not just two little snapshots.
And it was also teacher dependent. So the teachers were supposed to send the journals back, because they did do a post journal in terms of whether they wanted to continue or had plans, or what plans they had to continue learning or using their second language. So we didn't get all of them back, but.
And just an extra question on that research, was it mostly like purely monolingual Anglophones?
No.
Or was it other people who went to learn French as well?
We did have.
Did that correlate with the immigrant population or allophone population in any way, shape, or form?
I don't believe we had allophones, but we did have children of immigrants who were a minority. A vast minority. Can I say vast and minority? Yes. Yeah? Okay. But I didn't look at that either. That wasn't one of the goals.
With Monica, who's gone to her class, I'm sort of the keeper of the time. So we would have time for one more question or comment. Yeah, I didn't see anything. Nothing popped up. So last chance for people.
This monitor, the monitor is now gone too. I don't know.
Oh, so they may have logged out at that point. But we would have seen it
was
on
there
the screen.
after, but not right now.
Right now. Okay, well, on behalf of the CERVAL and l'Institut des langues officielles et du bilinguisme, Université d'Ottawa, Callie, thank you so much for coming to Ottawa and sharing your expertise with us. We really appreciate it. And we wish you a safe journey back to North Bay today.
Thank you. I have to give credit to my people. Oh, thank you. Oh, so they could type then,
Yeah.
but maybe that the
Just
person.
sometimes with Adobe Connect, if you raise your hand, then you can take a parole, but we didn't get this time. You got a few more things there popped up too. 3 more.
That's great. Thank you. That's great. So they.
I don't know if you know if any school boards, you know how when children get registered into school, you fill in this registration form and you have to describe what the language background of that child is. And I don't know if any of them recognize not official but bilingualism from birth, because I always find like the question is, so what is the first language of your child? And so
you don't have an opportunity.
Well, my
to
daughter,
say.
I'm Bulgarian by origin, and my wife's an Anglophone, and so she's a bilingual, raised in a one-parent, one-language family. And we always say, well, English is dominant, so English, Bulgarian. Every time this form comes back, and she's listed as Bulgarian, because I feel like there's a concern at the school that there's this other language that may make things difficult, or maybe she will not be, doing so well. And it's a French immersion school, so they're thinking, oh, maybe. So it's very interesting, and every time I correct it, and it comes back and they haven't fixed it.
Yeah, could it be as simple as a technological, like it doesn't allow them to, I mean, something silly?
Maybe, but I don't know that, like, this attitude of someone having 2 languages from birth. Also, there's a lot of work that needs to be done for people to start recognizing that as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. There's a lot of work to do yet.
Yeah, so this is very interesting.
Oh, thank you. Nice to meet you. Yeah, don't worry.
Je voulais savoir, pour la CLA, si on propose un symposium, comment on indique que les présentations sont reliées au symposium?
Il y a un formulaire, je pense,
oui, mais
pour le symposium.
Il y a un formulaire spécial pour le symposium?
Mais c'est ça ce que je pensais.
Je demande à...
Mela Sarkar.
Oui, parce qu'il y a des fois, à un moment, ils disent...
Ça, c'est le problème parce que nous changeons de système.
Il y a un truc électronique en ligne et puis c'est indiqué « Envoyez votre proposition à Mela Sarkar ». Juste... Alors, je vais envoyer à Mela Sarkar parce que ce sera le plus facile de mettre les 4 propositions ensemble et de tout relier. Parce que
ce serait parfait. Ça, c'est le problème. Nous sommes en train de... Ça, c'est la première fois que nous essayons ce système.
Parce que c'est ça, je me suis dit, bon, comment on indique que 1, 2, 3, 4, c'est relié au... Puis c'est 2 heures, hein, le symposium.
Non, si vous avez besoin de 3 heures, vous pouvez en avoir aussi.
Ah, on peut avoir 3 heures?
Oui, oui, vous pouvez l'indiquer.
OK. Bon. On finalise ça le mardi prochain.
C'est parfait.
C'est parfait, c'est pour le 31.
Mais c'est avant la limite.
Oui.
Alors, ce serait bon. J'ai entendu dire que c'est José qui vient. Mais c'est ça ce que j'ai compris. José is coming, I heard.
J'ai une question pour vous.
Dis-moi.
Un petit peu académique. Je suis en train de faire un projet pilote pour mon cours de curriculum, où il faut enseigner avec des ressources non traditionnelles pour l'acquisition des langues. Et moi, je voulais utiliser l'échange culturel comme méthode d'enseignement. Puis je me demandais si tu avais des documents ou des journaux personnels ou quelque chose de comment toi tu as enseigné à ton cours ou comment tu as préparé tes élèves pour leur échange.
Non, la seule chose que je peux t'offrir est par rapport à mon échange électronique. J'ai tous les directives. Oui, ce serait bon.
Ça serait bien, parce que moi, je regarde style global de l'échange culturel, que ce soit au travers de comme Rotary, Explore, Odyssey, Volunteer, électronique maintenant aussi, ça serait bien, juste de montrer de ça. C'est pas... It's not necessarily AFS where you have to pay $6,000 to go on exchange. There's a bunch of free exchanges that are done, or like scholarship exchange, where you can present that to your students.
Alors, Ça, c'est ta carte?
Ça, c'est ma carte.
Je peux te l'envoyer.
Well, it's my old.
I want to see it.
It's my old card.
It has a picture. You can get it.
Alors, je peux te l'envoyer, sinon, tu vas m'envoyer un message.
Sinon, je vais chercher ton
Parce
courriel
que
de
je l'ai.
quelqu'un qui
m'envoyer
l'a,
un-
par exemple, pour ensuite
OK, parfait.
faire un suivi.
Mais je le ferai.
Oh.
Unfortunately, it's out of date.
No, it's not. You still look the same. You still look the same. So
Well,
it's
it's
fine.
from this year. It's just
Oh,
I'm
okay.
no longer the exact
Oh, I
same.
see. But still, it's fine. Ça va. Tu as ajouté le logo DLS, non?
Oh my gosh, I still have my mic on.
Oh, I'm not wearing it today, but yesterday I
Non,
was
tu as
wearing
juste
it
sur la carte. Sur la carte.
on the card.
Yeah,
I should just
pourquoi pas?
replace arts with
Voilà. Are you on the executive team? But still.